Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're tackling a question that seems like it should have a really obvious answer, but, well, you might be surprised. Where exactly was the ancient Lanka from the epic Ramayana?
For centuries, pretty much everyone has assumed that the Lanka from the epic is, of course, the island nation of Sri Lanka. But what if that's not right? We're going to dive into some research that treats this whole thing not as a myth, but as a genuine historical puzzle. A solvable one, with clues hidden in ancient texts, geology, and even the stars.
Okay, before we dig into the clues, we have to get our heads around the unique framework these researchers are using. They call it sathology, which they define as the science of truth. What this means is they approach texts like the Ramayana not as mythology or some kind of allegory, but as a literal, factual record of historical and scientific events. So when you use that framework, this whole investigation turns into something like a real-life treasure hunt. The claim is that all the clues are just hiding in plain sight, in the Earth's geology, in the movement of the stars, and right there in the ancient texts themselves. All right, let's get into the first major clue. And this one's a big one, because it argues that the very geography of the world was drastically different at the time the Ramayana is said to have taken place.
The entire investigation really hinges on this one bold claim. The researchers assert that around 12,000 BCE, the date they've calculated for the events of the Ramayana, the landmass we now call Sri Lanka was physically connected to the Indian mainland. It just wasn't an island.
So you might be asking, how is that even possible? Well, the answer lies in this number. According to geological data, global sea levels, way back then, were about 50 meters lower than they are today. And a drop that big? Well, it would completely redraw the map.
So here's the crucial point. With sea levels 50 meters lower, the land that's currently under the very shallow Palk Strait would have just been exposed, dry land. This means Sri Lanka would have been a peninsula, not an island at all. And if that's true, it begs a massive question. Why would an army need to build a bridge to cross an ocean that wasn't even there?
All right, so that's the geological clue. Let's move to the next set of clues and see how this theory builds. This time, we're looking directly at the source's interpretation of the Valmiki Ramayana itself.
The source points to what they see as a huge directional problem. To get to modern Sri Lanka from India, you have to go southeast. But the text is very specific. It says that from their starting point at Mahendragiri, the army traveled due south and immediately came to the ocean, not the hundreds of kilometers of land that would be in their way. Now, what's so fascinating here is the claim that this isn't some new, radical idea. The source points to this long line of thinkers, from ancient sages to modern researchers, who they say all reached the exact same conclusion, completely independently of one another. And this quote really sums up their point. The strength of the theory, they argue, comes from having all these different separate lines of inquiry, all pointing to the very same conclusion. It suggests corroboration without any collaboration. To back up their 12,000 BCE timeline, the source also brings in astronomical data. They argue that the text description of the star Agastya's visibility from certain locations could only have happened during that specific time period. They're essentially using the stars as a kind of celestial clock to date the events. Of course, this leads us to the biggest question of all. I mean, it's the elephant in the room. If the original Lanka of the Ramayana wasn't the island of Sri Lanka, why are all the stories, the temples, and the sacred sites associated with it located there today? To answer that, this source proposes this really interesting concept they call shifting memories. The basic idea is that as people move and migrate, they take their most cherished stories and place names right along with them.
And this slide illustrates that principle perfectly. We see this happen all the time in history. When colonists moved from England, they named their new homes New England. When people moved from Vrindavan in India, they established a new Vrindavan in the US. The theory is that the sacred memory of Lanka was transplanted onto the island, over time in the exact same way.
And on top of all that, the source points out that the name Sri Lanka is actually very modern. For most of its history, the island was known as Simhala Dweep or Ceylon. It only officially adopted the name Sri Lanka in 1972. They argue that while Simhala Dweep may have been part of Ravana's kingdom, that doesn't mean it was the location of his capital city, Lanka. So after following all of these different clues, what's the big picture takeaway from this alternate interpretation of history? What does it all mean? In a nutshell, the whole argument really rests on these three pillars. First, you have a geological argument that the map itself was different. Second, a textual argument that the path described in the story doesn't match the modern location. And third, a cultural argument that explains the confusion through this idea of transplanted memory.
So while this theory doesn't give us a final, single answer, it presents us with a pretty profound puzzle. Could it be that today's Sri Lanka is a living memorial to a now lost Lanka? It's a fascinating question about how geography, memory, and scripture can all weave together to completely reshape our understanding of the past.